We'll do great, I'm sure, and we're rolling.
All right.
Take it away.
Talk to us about Summer of Love.
Yeah, Summer of Love, one of the best times in my life and probably in the history of the universe. We're talking about something that's 54 years old, at least. And that's why when I mention it to people nowadays, they often have no frame of reference. Um, some people will have no idea who JFK was. It's amazing. Little is known about our own American history, but particularly this movement was so grand, and it was such a time for great music, for artistry, for film, for the idea of peace and love to really mean something. And why I liked it is because I was at the University of San Francisco. I was about 21 years old, and this movement was just right for me. So I walked a few blocks down to the Haight-Ashbury and was in the midst of this wonderful time. And starting out with the music, because you'd hear the music from the university. It would just be drifting down to the park, so that would lure you there. And you would see Santana, you would see people from the Grateful Dead, you would see roaming in the crowd and getting ready to play for free. Nothing like outside lands where you're paying $400 or $500 for the day. Here you could see all these great bands that were prominent at the time. One comes to mind is Big Brother and the Holding Company, where Janis Joplin got her start. There was also the Quicksilver Messenger Service, a very iconic band. And so they were getting their feet wet, so to speak, in music and playing for free in the Golden Gate Park and also in the Panhandle. The Panhandle that led you into the park was just a great place to hang out. Much in the same way that we might hang out here at the beach. It was a place for anyone to stop at the room, sit down and listen to music. And maybe you'd share a joint, or maybe you'd share beer or wine, whatever was happening. And it was so free that people walking by would just be invited to join in. It wasn't kind of restricted like I see some activities nowadays where people will group, perhaps to be socially distant, I don't know. But there's a grouping of people that is separate from other groups. That strikes me as being particularly unusual. If you were to go, say, to the Great Meadow today nearby here, en route to Safeway, you would see large groups of millennials and people who are there to be able to play games and drink with their friends. But it's not, it's very exclusive and it's very elitist. You don't just automatically go over to your neighbors and join in and share with whatever they're eating or drinking. So that is something that is particularly alarming to me because the whole movement for hippies was to have a chance to socially visit and to be able to learn from others and to share what you know. So it was a great melting pot for ideas. There was a paper called The Oracle, written by a friend of mine, Alan Cohen, and he put out about 12 editions. And these are now collector items. I was going to bring one, but couldn't find it. I have a few of them, and they had simply newspaper print with an advertisement for the Jefferson Airplane or for Jerry Garcia and the Dead. And then you'd have maybe a little item about what's going on in the Haight. And there was a place called the Straight Theater, which was a wonderful place for music. And the Straight Theater also had acts, people who wanted to come off from the floor, from the audience and join in, maybe play with a group or just be free enough to be able to perform, assuming, you know, that you had some ability. It wasn't just free-for-all. You had to be knowledgeable. And the music, though, was the salient thing here. It pervaded the Panhandle all the way through Golden Gate Park, and that was where you went. There was a place still there called Hippie Hill, which is at the beginning of the park off of Stanton. And that's where we would gather to smoke dope and to play Frisbee. Frisbee was enormously popular. And if you had a dog, the dog would be trained to catch the Frisbee in the air. It was just magnificent. So everybody is blowing bubbles, smoking dope, running around, dancing, and listening to this great music that's there for free. Again, I have to stress the freedom here, and the fact that it's available to everyone. There was really a sense of diversity and all-inclusiveness.
Welcomingness.
Welcomingness, yeah, exactly. And you never had any trepidation about going up to another group and just sitting down and being welcomed.
It does seem really different.
And
from now.
embraced,
Yeah.
and physically embraced. There was a freedom in the way men and women interacted. It wasn't so much a notion of couples. Yeah, it was a matter of being able to engage with other people, but without necessarily worrying about whether you're invading in a relationship. That's not to say there weren't boundaries, but there was a freedom of expression, which could include hugging and dancing, with a stranger, and close dancing, necessarily, if that were if that was possible. It just was okay. There were no prohibitions. Of course, again, there are still boundaries, but people seem to respect those, and still have the freedom. So that was very, very special.
And that was new with that generation?
I think so.
Kind of friendliness and openness compared to your parents or others?
Yeah, well, just before that, we had in North Beach, particularly noticeable was the Bohemian beatnik movement. And again, here's a situation where I was a little bit too young, walking by one of the cafes and seeing these Bohemian poets that I didn't know. And when I look back now, it was Gregory Corso, it was Philip Lamantia, it was Michael Schneider, people who were prominent then, Kerouac, Neil Cassidy, all of these people. Again, I'm about 12 or 13.
Jeez.
So, yeah. But my dad...
Just starting up a few names, just some of the guys who were hanging around. It's like, are you kidding? Jesus.
My dad knew Ferlinghetti well, because my dad was in the North Beach B of A banking situation. And so Ferlinghetti would come in, my dad, and he would talk Italian and just talk about his City Lights Press. He had just started, and how there was going to be a big case against Ginsberg's Howl, and how Ferlinghetti wanted to defend it. And of course that really put him on the map, and it put City Lights on the map, and all of the beats that were there. So I did get a chance to meet a few of them. Jack Michelin, Jack Hirschman, who was still prominent, Michael McClure, and a few that floated in and out.
Jack Michelin.
Yeah, Jack Michelin was a poet and a painter, and he would take his canvas on the bus and go to North Beach and just set up and paint the fishing boats, or go to North Beach and set his canvas up in Washington Square, and just be able to freely paint and express himself, and then maybe recite some poetry later in the evening at one of the cafes. There was a lot of performing, but again, that was not as free. People were sort of isolated. The big thing was to be cool. And to be cool meant that you wore your black turtleneck and you smoked your cigarette or your joint, but it wasn't necessarily you and a bunch of other people. It was maybe you and
your brain.
Yeah, you and your brain, and being cool and being poetic, and drinking your red wine, and being seen as a beat. So again,
what did your father think of that?
My father liked it.
Yeah,
he liked it, although that was as far away from his life as it could be. He's a serious workaholic, strong work ethic, strong Italian family background. But he found inspiration in that. My dad would like to occasionally sit down and be maybe scrolling out a few lines of poetry. Very private, not for anyone's observation, just strictly something he would want to do in the evenings. Or as I mentioned to you before, sit in the dark and smile and rehearse the day to himself, kind of speaking about things that happened at the bank.
With the glowing cigar.
Yeah, with the glowing cigar, and sometimes a fireplace.
Yeah.
Sometimes that was roaring, and he'd be in a dark room with a roaring fireplace, smoking a cigar, drinking his brandy. His brandy. The brandy was important, but the brandy had to be in your coffee. So it was a special glass that you bought in North Beach that could take the heat of hot coffee with the brandy and then a little bit of lemon peel. And lemon peel was, and then of course you got into the Negroni and the Campari and those North Beach drinks. They didn't have absinthe. My father would have been interested in that because he liked a variety of liqueurs, and he had quite a collection of aperitifs and liqueurs. He loved Angostura bitters, which he would put into his drinks. And so I try to consider holding on to that, and I still like doing that occasionally for myself, making myself a nice drink, and then looking at some poetry or reading for a while, and having that as my after dinner drink to look forward to. That's who my dad conceived it. Also in my dad's situation, if there was not wine on the table and French bread and cheese, then it wasn't a good meal. And if you went to somewhere and was invited for dinner and they didn't have those things, you'd hear about it. Oh, the meal was okay, but they didn't have what I needed. So he was very rigid in what he wanted. But years later, as I grew up, I began to see, hey, this makes sense. This is very cool to have things that are important to you. Coffee the way you want it. A special dessert, this your dessert. And the cheese you like. You like Asiago.
Hard to argue with.
And Parmigiano.
My kind of guy.
Yeah, he liked the specific
red wine.
Yeah, with the red wine. And
but let's move back to the summer of love topic.
Love topic. So we talked a little bit about music at Golden Gate Park. The big event there was, I believe it was July 7th, maybe. Don't quote me on that, but I want to say 67. The month of July, or early date, 67. There's a call out for everyone to show up at Golden Gate Park. Word gets out, it wasn't about Instagram or being able to notify people electronically. You just would hear about it in the Haight-Ashbury in advance.
Just people talking about it.
People talking about it, word of mouth, maybe flyers go out. So the human being, it later became extremely famous because on that day, 50,000 people assembled at Golden Gate Park, which had never happened before. There were no occasions for large gatherings of that type, of that size. And here I am in the middle of it, because I always make a point of getting to the middle of whatever is going on. If it's a cruise ship, Leslie and I drag her to the front row. She gets pissed off. Why do we have to be from it? You have to ask. So sometimes she would get really angry with me because she didn't want to be, necessarily right up front. But the point of being up front is that you might get picked. See, a comedian might say, hey, Santa Claus, come up here, which did happen. So I go up on stage, talk to people.
I bet you'd love that.
So here is a little dais set up, and Allen Ginsberg is sitting on one side. It's a true story, Allen Ginsberg. On the other side of him is Ginsberg and, of course, Timothy Leary. And Timothy Leary is stoned on acid, and Alan is smoking hash. And so this is going on, and there's this podium, and they're asked to speak, and they're doing rounds of Hare Krishna, the Hare Krishna thing. And so it's being sung, and it's being repetitiously chanted and chanted. And so I went up and got in the middle of them, and that's how I met both of them. It hardly matters because everybody was so ripped. But I know, well, they were stoned or pretty high, so it was not like anybody's going to remember who you meet when there's 50,000 people. But I remember. But you will. I remember because it was big for me. And at that time, other than speeches that were given, they would introduce the musicians. So on another occasion, I had a chance to witness Jimi Hendrix play, and had a chance to meet him And then I became a friend of Janis Joplin's because she would hang out in North Beach. And then
How did you become friends?
Well, because I knew she would going into these places at a certain time. So it would be like going to Cafe Trieste and knowing that so-and-so's going to be there having an espresso. It was just a known thing. She really liked North Beach. Although she also was in Haight-Ashbury. She hung out with the Grateful Dead. And if you were able to get into those parties, they would go on for 2 or 3 days, night and day in these old Victorian homes. On Fulton Street, again, close to the Panhandle. With
Did you ever go to those?
I did go to several of those. And again, everybody's so stoned, music blaring so loud. It's nothing that particularly stands out as one big event. As much as that human being stood out. First time 50,000 people were gathering. And the police were very reasonable about it. Everybody pretty much behaved. It was maybe some drunken episodes, but nothing of a bad nature to cast a bad light on us. It was the vibes were mellow and fresh and wholesome. So that was such a big commencement for what was to become the hippie movement, and to have busloads of people with flowers, with their flowers in their hair. Not so much the guys, but the women would all come in with flowers in their hair from all over America, busloads every day, hundreds of kids coming in, and looking for a place to stay, and ending up sleeping in the park, and being rousted from the doorways in the Haight-Ashbury, and there was just no place for them to go. And that created a problem for the city, because what are we going to do with these kids? They're, in some cases, runaways. Their parents are concerned about them. They're finding drugs, and they're getting perhaps bad drugs, because eventually what ruined the Haight was to have people come in who were selling bad coke and bad acid and bad hash. And so that pretty much caused the real end of that whole street hanging out kind of lifestyle, where people would just be on the street for days and days, just camp, so to speak, and then wait for someone, especially the young kids, would wait for a group of kids to give them food or bring them drugs or whatever, and then they would go. The ones that were there were able to go out and forage for themselves. So it was kind of a relay system, 24 hours a day with hundreds of kids. Looking for places, looking for acceptance.
So that was over the course of a few months then?
A few years. The whole hippie movement really lasted about 2.5 years. One day they decided, after the police were getting to be very, very vigilant about putting a stop to people hanging out in doorways, they said, well, look, we've got to do something. The city got very much behind the effort to get rid of or to find places for them and maybe put a stop to this. So the people that were in the Haight-Ashbury running the shops and head shops would say, kindly said, okay, we're going to have the death of the hippie. So they had a funeral procession with people. You may have heard about this? Yeah. And they had these large puppets that would be in the funeral procession, going up and down.
Really?
Yeah, like
like animals or people? Or?
Animals. Animals, and then people would be in those and be walking down the street. And there are a lot of pictures of this. About 3 years ago, the Young Museum did a definitive study of the hippie movement in San Francisco. It was a great show, and I believe it's in their permanent archive.
Oh, really?
And I don't know if it's possible to have access online. But we should look into that, because you will see the fashions, you will see the posters, the poster art, which became such a big part of the movement. You will see record album covers and pictures of all the performers in the Golden Gate Park area. So,
I remember hearing about that summer. This was right when I moved here.
Yes, that's right. 3 years ago. It was a great show. And I found myself in a few pictures in these blow-ups, these big black and white blow-ups.
Wow.
Yeah, and then a book was made. I don't have the book, but it's just simply entitled something like Hippies or Hippie Movement or something like that. Lavishly illustrated coffee table book, marvelous book. Limited printing, but I imagine it's still available. Just never got it. At the time, it was probably an expensive book.
Sure.
Now I want to have it.
Yeah.
But more questions. I know.
Yeah.
What
time are we at right now?
Oh yeah.
We are at 20 minutes.
Can we stop it here?
Sure.
Yeah.